its original name was the Ferdinand, and that was really the name the Germans used for it most of the war. It's got a complex background, a complex history behind it. Back in 1940, the German military, they have a specification for a breakthrough weapon. Both Henschel and Porsche go off to design a tank that's called VK 3001, 30 for 30-ton class. Now, by May of 1941, there's a meeting with Hitler present where they basically scrap or completely alter most of the German tank program. And as part of that program, a new specification is issued for a much heavier tank, much better armoured, and they really want the 88mm gun, the famous flat gun, that's now to be used in an anti-tank role, added to that new tank. Now, Porsche decides he's going to take his Type 100, his VK3001 project, and actually develop that into the new tank. So he's already started work on a vehicle which is going to have petrol-electric drive. It's got a certain hull shape to it. He develops that further forward as part of an answer to this requirement for the new tank that we end up knowing as the famous Tiger 1. Now, we know as well that development process is not easy because Porsche is so keen all the time to try and use the cutting edge of what he's developed in terms of transmission. Porsche's been around a long time in the military contracts, right back to the First World War. And he's keen on the idea of petrol-electric drive. That again has been around quite some time. There's First World War French vehicles with petrol-electric drive as a tank. So, and you've got things like trams, there's other vehicles that are using petrol-electric, so it's nothing new. But the problem he's using now materials that are fairly new in the system, and he's trying to actually get that all squeezed into the hull of his Tank 101 type project. And that's a problem for him because it means he's got issues of overheating, space constraints, and where are we going to put all the turret gear for this particular vehicle. Now, 100 hulls are actually built by Krupp for this project before they end up having to cancel it in essence. The tank project, the two vehicles made by Porsche and Henschel, are demonstrated on Hitler's birthday in April 1942, and it becomes quite evident quite quickly that the Henschel design, which is much simpler, is a better vehicle to go with. Now, Porsche's own design, he keeps on working on it. They keep believing this is going to be a tank that's going to go into production. But Albert Speer finally in September of 42 says, look, this isn't going to work as a main battle tank or as a tank in the way they're envisaging the Tiger 1 to be. So they then decide, let's make it into something the Germans would have called a Panzerjäger or a tank killer vehicle instead. And so Krupp come along. They design a casement to go on the top of the hulls. Those 100 hulls, as we've said, have already been built. They make 90 of them and convert them into being a Panzerjäger. And that means adding this whopping great big 88mm K-43 gun.
Almost out of range of the fighter,
the idea
Commander.
behind
Turn
it is
around.
what you've got here is as soon as they were using the 88mm barrel length L56, we call it on the Tiger 1, they decide they want an even more powerful gun. So they use the same caliber, the 88mm, the size of the hole at the end of the barrel, but they make that gun a lot longer
stick, Commander.
with a
Awaiting
much
instructions.
bigger projectile case to go
I need your help
inside
up here,
it.
Commander.
Hence the
Hull status
L71.
critical.
It's
I
much
don't have
longer
much
barrel.
time left.
Originally
Hull
behind
breach
it
on
all
the
again,
fighter.
it was a flat
It's gone,
gun,
sir.
but they changed the size of the case. They make the case slightly stubbier so it can be fitted inside a vehicle, but slightly wider so it can carry the same amount of propellant. So when this is being fitted, they've already put it on an improvised chassis, something called the Hornice, which was basically a Panzer IV, Panzer III chassis combined. And they use that as an open-topped, as a tank killer, basically that sort of magnificently powerful gun on an open-top chassis. So it's already being used in the anti-tank gun role. They put it on this vehicle that they then called Ferdinand. Ferdinand
Okay,
after, of
powering
course,
up the
Ferdinand
SLS.
Porsche,
Stand by,
and
Commander.
it becomes a tremendously powerful tank-killing weapon. The problem
Fighters online.
is
Ready for
even
action.
though they've got that casement on it to give plenty of room inside, you've got 2 loaders, by the way, inside there because the rounds are so big. So they up the specification for the armour. You end up with 20 centimetres, so 200 millimetres of armour on the front of this vehicle. Very thick armour protection. But that drivetrain and also the suspension system that Porsche has come up with is vulnerable. And the issue there is because his engines don't really work to start with, so they end up getting the reliable HL 120 engines. They were the engines that powered the Panzer III and the Panzer IV. They get 2 of those engines, squeeze them in the tank. They actually run electric generators, which then take the power to the rear of the vehicle where the drive sprockets are, and that's where you've got the electric motors. Now, it's air-cooled engines, and if you actually look at photographs of the engine decks, everything is tightly packed inside the space. Originally, all of that was going to be at the back of the tank, but once they have to reconfigure to make this a Panzerjäger, you've got 2 crew members in the front, they put the engine compartment in the middle, and the rear is the fighting compartment. But even there, they have to close off the 2 areas for the electric motors to power the drives at the back. So it's a very, very tight fit in there, even though it looks such a big vehicle. And that drivetrain has tremendous problems that come with it. Lots of mechanical failures, breakdowns, hard work to get at the actual engines and the electric motors to help try and repair them. And the other thing Porsche comes up with, he comes up with a longitudinal torsion bar suspension system. And that suspension system, in other words, instead of the torsion bars running across the vehicle from side to side with their twisting that helps give a spring down, these bars are in pairs with pairs of wheels on the side. And it would take a brighter man than me to try and explain to you exactly how that type of torsion bar works. But it's complex and it fails a lot. That's one of the problems. The upside, if you take out the suspension system from being inside the hull, it means you've got slightly more room inside there. By bolting it on the outside, gives you more volume space inside for ammunition, engines, crew, etc. So all of these things together are pushed into production and made at
Yes, Commander. I'll remain in situ and await further instructions.
Austria, and the vehicles are completed in about May of 43. The last ones actually come off the production line. They make 90 of them all. They convert a few of the original hulls into what becomes recovery tanks without the casement on the rear there, just a front cab there so that they can drag the vehicles off the battlefield. And these vehicles are pushed out very quickly out to the Eastern Front to take part in the Battle of Kursk. Now, we know much is written about the Battle of Kursk, speculated the biggest tank battle of all time. But in the last few years, people have revised that view. Probably there was bigger tank battles earlier in 1941 when Germany first invades Russia. But Kursk goes down in history as a stunning, the last big major German attack on the Eastern Front. And it's first thought of as early as April 43, the planning begins. But it doesn't actually kick off till July. And by that time, the Russians have had plenty of warning about where this attack is coming. Now, the Germans delay because sometimes it's about the weather, sometimes it's about equipment, things like these new Panzerjäger tanks coming, and of course the famous Panther. They're waiting till these tanks can actually get to the front line to hopefully make an impact on the battle. But the
You're in danger of losing the link with the fire, Commander.
Massively deep defensives, and when those initial attacks goes in July, the Russians absorb them. They have a very, very clever defensive system of minefields, barbed wire, anti-tank guns. And what happens, and it's in Guderian, he actually writes up an after-action report where he describes how the Ferdinands are being used. What quite often happens is they are being used to go ahead of the infantry as a kind of armoured wedge, burst their way through. And they find themselves isolated because they're not always working with Panzer Grenadiers, guys with other track vehicles to keep up with them. If they're waiting for the traditional infantry, they suddenly find themselves in the middle of the battlefield, this very deep defensive system, and they suffer from things like artillery attacks and also as well The fact they don't have a close defense weapon, in other words, a machine gun in something like a ball mount, just like other Sturmgeschützes, the Sturmgeschütz, the Panzer III version, doesn't have a close defense weapon either. So they followed that trait. And that meant they were vulnerable sometimes for Russian anti-tank teams trying to work around the sides and actually crawl up to try and demolish the vehicle or break a track or to get what would be called a mobility kill. Now, at the end of the battle, Guderian writes he thinks actually about 19 of the 90 vehicles deployed are actually knocked out. And what you find then between the end of July right the way through to Christmas of 1943 is consistently the two main units, Panzer Jaeger battalions, that's 653 and 654, they are both consistently writing back to headquarters saying we need time to do some serious work on our vehicles. But consistently, because this now is the period the German army is starting to go into retreat, vehicles are being formed into small battle groups, rushed to plug holes in the front line or to lead small counterattacks all the time. So again, this sense of being able to actually work on the problems of the vehicles is always constantly being put off. They never seem to have enough time to do that. The factories are sending out kits out to the front line, trying to help remedy some of these problems, but by the end of the year, it's decided that remaining tanks are to be brought back to the Nibelungenwerk to have a rebuild program. So those tanks actually come all the way back to Austria. They go through a rebuild program in December and January of 1944. And then, of course, we've got the problem, or the Germans have the problems, that there's the landings in Italy. And the landings at Anzio mean that the German, the 653, is actually rushed down to try and stem these landings. They've only got 11 of the 14 tanks they were expecting are ready. So those go down to try and stem the Anzio landings, and that's where this particular tank is captured. Again, most of those vehicles break down at different points, are trying to be recovered, fewer knocked out by enemy action, and it looks like this vehicle was actually abandoned and booby-trapped while it's sitting in a depot behind the beachhead. So it's sitting there actually waiting for this repairs or recovery when the Allies actually advance. And this particular tank is then taken back to Aberdeen Proving Ground in America and evaluated. And we're very lucky the Americans have loaned it to us here for our Tiger display that's on at the moment. So in a way, that's symptomatic what happens to the remaining elephants as they were then called after the rebuild. Pretty much after the rebuild, most of the German records still refer to them as Ferdinands. But this idea of a name change comes pretty much later in 44, and it starts creeping into some of the documentation, but not that much. But those vehicles that remained, they have terrible supply problems. They are moved from pillar to post, and in the end, only 2 of them actually make it out of Italy. And one of the points they make there, the Italian terrain is not good for a vehicle like this. This is fantastic on open countryside where the great value of that very powerful gun can be brought to bear. Firing high explosive, this gun could fire out to, if it lifts the barrel, by the way, that ball mount, it can go about 18 degrees up, 15 degrees either side, 8 degrees down, depression. So if you lifted that barrel up and fired a high explosive round, you could actually go out to 6 kilometers away with a high explosive round. Not its real intention. Its real intention is with the armor-piercing round, the Panzergranate round. And that particular round, again, this could quite easily engage all Allied tanks at something like 2,000 meters away, so 2 kilometers away, and get it a kill because of the power behind that metal of the shot. And also, but inside that shot, once it's come through your tank, there's a bursting charge as well, just to finish everything off. The Germans tend not to fire a completely solid shot. They always tend to add a bursting charge there. So a very impressive gun, very unreliable drivetrain, terrible maintenance problems they had there. And all in all, you might think that added together, this is one of those German tanks we all get obsessed about, get very excited about, look at all the great names involved in its process, and yet ultimately you've got to say it probably could be judged a failure because it doesn't add up to all that investment in time, energy that goes into it, and certainly expectations from the frontline troops. The rebuild program, by the way, when they did it over December, what they actually do is they're trying to regress some of the problems or redress some of the problems there. So they give the commander a cupola. So all of a sudden he's now got 7 periscopes to look out of. Before he was using things like scissor periscopes to look through the top of the hatch. They changed the engine decks on the front, and that was because the engine decks, too often, bits of artillery shell or rainwater even leaves, things could get into the engines and affect the electrics. So they changed the nature of the engine decks on the front. They add a little bit more armour in certain places, and they add this ball mount so you could fit an MG34 or 42 machine gun there with this extra plate over the front. So these were little things that they're answering. At the front here you've got the bow machine gunner and radio operator. Next to him is the driver with his periscopes there, and then you've got 2 loaders because of the size of the rounds inside the rear of the fighting compartment, commander and a gunner. So a 6-man crew, fairly slow tank, about 12 miles an hour maximum speed on the open road, but then again, usual story, that wasn't its aim. It doesn't have to go too fast in the role it's trying to play. But overall, as we said, it's one of these peculiar vehicles. It's really actually a bodge from an earlier design, and you can see the elements of what might have been the Tiger 1P or the Porsche version. If you just imagine that casement taken off and the famous Krupp turret that ends up on the Tiger 1 dropped on top of this vehicle, because that might have been the tank that beat, if it had a reliable drivetrain system, the Henschel version. Probably understandably and quite rightly, the German military go for Henschel because it's more reliable, it's simpler in production, and you don't need things like the copper that you're going to need for the electric motors that end up in this vehicle. So again, only 90 of these are made. Don't forget 1,300 Tiger 1s, so that would have been an awful lot more copper that they would have needed if they'd have gone for the Porsche option. So overall, perhaps you could judge this tank as a bit of a failure. It's the beginning of that kind of megalomania that Hitler shows in wanting a vehicle to be even bigger and even more impressive on the battlefield, with certainly a gun that is leaps and bounds ahead of anything that it's fighting against. So, and again, from our point of view here at the Tank Museum, we're very grateful for the American Ordnance Collection to lend us this particular vehicle.
Programming limpet drone. Prospector limpet engaged. Asteroid scan complete. Programming limpet drone. Programming limpet drone. Collector limpet expired. Collector limpet expired. Collector limpet expired.
Connection lost. Error.
Programming limpet drone. Programming limpet drone. Programming limpet drone. Collector limpet expired. Programming limpet drone. Collector limpet expired.
You can trust me with the controls, Commander. I'll wait here then, Commander. Let me know when you have further orders. You're reaching telepresence range limit. We don't want to lose the link. Control transfer complete. I'm ready for further instructions.
Programming limpet drone. Prospector limpet engaged. Collector limpet expired. Programming limpet drone. Asteroid scan complete. Prospector limpet engaged. Asteroid scan complete. Programming limpet drone. Prospector limpet failed. Prospector limpet engaged. Asteroid scan complete.